Hi, my name is Amanda McWhirt. I'm a horticulture production extension specialist with the University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension Service. Today I'm going to get started by talking about what are the basics of blackberry production. So if, for instance, you are interested in going into commercial blackberry production, what are some things that you would need to keep in mind and how would you get started? Because this is part of a four-part class that follows blackberry production throughout the entire season, we are going to start off by talking about what goes on in winter in blackberry production and focus a lot on winter pruning. So before going into any type of commercial enterprise, it's important to evaluate what the market is doing and see if the market is increasing for that particular commodity or if it's decreasing. So let's talk about the blackberry market. Consumers increasingly are very aware of the health benefits of the types of foods that they put into their bodies. And berries are very often seen as superfoods or foods that are very high in vitamin content, and blackberries are really no exception to that. So as consumers increase their demand for berries and for blackberries, are our local markets meeting that demand? So we have a pretty good graph here that comes out of the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service, and I'm going to kind of set up the graph for you before we talk about it. Here at the bottom you can see that it's going through each week of the year, 1 through 52. On the left hand side we have the shipments in millions of pounds of blackberries that are entering the US market. And you can see all of these different bars over the different weeks represent where those blackberries are coming from, whether they be from Mexico in blue bars, from California in red, Guatemala in green, or Oregon in purple. On the opposite hand side, we have the estimated seasonal price index, and so that is represented by this blue line. So you can see that the price goes down and up throughout the season based off of how much supply there is in the market. So you can see that overall Mexico really predominates in flooding the US markets with blackberries throughout the season. And that there's really this peak in Mexican blackberries somewhere around week 18 or 19 in the season. But then you can see that Mexico starts to get out of the market and overall the supply is quite low, which results in an increase in the price. So where does southeastern blackberries fall into this? Well, southeastern blackberries actually start to come off in this area right here where we're seeing this circle where Mexican blackberries are going out of the market and we start to see this price increase. Now you'll see that the price continues to increase until Mexican blackberries come back on the market around week 46. And this correlates to somewhere around September or early November. Now this is going to be important later on when we talk about different types of blackberries that can actually now produce in the fall, and if there's any potential for those to be successful here in the South. But overall, we are seeing that as the Southeast comes into the market, we do have this increasing demand that is not being met with current production. Now, if we also take that into consideration that while people are interested in the health benefits of their food, they're also interested in where their food is coming from, and increasingly there's a demand for local produce. It's also important to keep in mind that blackberries are actually native to the United States and to much of the Southeast, so they're already very well adapted to our region, and that there are new thornless varieties, which makes growing blackberries a lot less of a sticky situation. Alright, so I painted a pretty sunny outlook of the potential for commercial blackberry production to be successful in the Southeast. But before jumping into any type of commercial production system, it is important to weigh what types of major risks might limit crop success, particularly for your specific location. Weather is a major issue for any type of agricultural production, but specifically for blackberries, when we have late spring freezes as we've been having over the last several years, or heavy rains during the harvest season, those can have direct impacts on the yields and fruit quality that you are able to achieve in any given year. With that, changes in annual supply and demand of blackberries into the market can have a big impact on the price that you're able to demand for your crop. Because blackberries are highly perishable, it is important to have your market ready and able to receive your berries when you're in harvest, because they cannot be held for a long period of time. Pests can be a major issue for us in the Southeast. We are in a hot and humid climate, which favors fungal diseases in general, and we do have some new emerging insect pests like spotted-winged Drosophila, which are not native to the United States, that can be a major pest of blackberries. Labor is a major issue for any type of horticultural production system, and this is particularly true for crops like blackberries that have a very short window where they must be harvested over about 4 to 6 weeks, and then throughout the rest of the season there's very often much less labor demand. And so this is an important consideration of whether or not you will be able to find suitable labor during that period. Then there can be farm-specific risks that are unique to your specific site, whether it be birds, deer, issues with soil fertility, or specific disease or insect issues, the distance to your market, etc. All of these risks should really be taken together and weighed against the potential for success. All right, so after you've weighed the pros and cons of commercial blackberry production as a potential enterprise for your specific site, it's important to know a little bit about the biology and the life cycle of blackberries to understand why we grow them the way that we do. So that's what I'm going to talk about next before I start talking about the specifics of production. All right, let's talk about the different parts of a blackberry plant. Blackberries are a perennial crown that's planted somewhat level with the ground. You'll actually notice that part of the crown is sticking up out of the ground in this diagram. Out of this perennial crown, new canes will emerge every year. These canes have a 2-year life cycle. In the first year, the canes are referred to as primocanes. Primocanes are typically only vegetative. That means they only produce leaves. They do not produce any flowers or fruit. Primocanes will emerge sometime in late spring and will grow throughout the summer and fall of their first year. They will then be overwintered into their second year, and in the spring of that year, they will technically be referred to as floricanes. Now, floricanes do produce flowers and fruit, here represented by these little red clusters. But I want you to notice that these fruit are actually being produced not on this main cane, but at the ends of these lateral canes that are coming off and branching off of this main cane. These lateral canes are sometimes just referred to as laterals. Now, there are certain production practices, including tipping, which is the type of pruning that we conduct every year to try and increase the number of lateral branches that are produced for each cane. Now, this is done to try and increase the amount of yield that we get per each cane. After the floricane is done fruiting, it will die sometime in the late summer or fall. It will then be removed through pruning. At that point, all that will remain is the primocanes that emerged earlier on in that same year. Those primocanes will then be held over into the next year to become the next year's floricanes. So in this way, we have this biennial cycle where this year's primocanes are next year's floricanes, and this year's floricanes were last year's primocanes. Now, this has been the typical production cycle for a long time, where we only had varieties of blackberries that would flower on floricane type canes. But we now do have some newer varieties that actually produce flowers and fruit on first year canes or primocanes. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail later on. I do want to point out that there's a couple of different ways that blackberry plants can self-propagate themselves. If a blackberry cane falls over on the ground, it will start to root in and produce a daughter plant. For this reason, we recommend using some type of trellising system to keep the canes up off of the ground and try and keep management a little bit easier in the production system. Daughter plants can also be produced through suckers of the roots. These suckers may come up in the row middles where they will need to be removed, again to facilitate production, or they may come up in the middle of the rows and fill in the row over time. Now I want to clarify this floricane and primocane thing a little bit more because this is something that tends to confuse people quite a bit. So here's a picture of what this actually looks like in an actual blackberry planting. Here we have these floricanes, which are our second year canes, and you can see they have flowered and they're now starting to produce some tiny little green fruit. So this is a cane that grew in the previous year and is now 2 years old. From the base of the plant, you see that there's these new primocanes that are emerging in the current year. And they are not going to produce any flowers or fruit. They're going to remain vegetative. Now you can notice that these primocanes that are emerging all have 5 leaves, whereas typically floricanes have 3 leaves. And typically these primocanes also, as they start to emerge, have this lighter green color. So that will help you distinguish between new emerging primocanes and the previous year's floricanes. Alright, so we talked about the different cane types that are produced by blackberry plants, but let's also talk about the different fruiting types. So as I mentioned before, floricane fruiting types were predominantly what we've had through the history of blackberry production. And these again were types that the first year the primocanes came out, the primocanes were overwintered to become floricanes in their second year, and then they flowered and fruited. But here in Arkansas, our blackberry plant breeder, Dr. John Clark, has actually developed some primocane fruiting types. And these are types that the first year primocanes are produced, and late in that first year they flower and produce fruit. So I want to sort of distinguish how the timing for these two fruiting types is different, and then how they are managed. So again, floricane fruiting types flower in the spring in the southeast, and then they fruit in early summer, sometime between early June and late July. They are managed with regular pruning in the fall and winter, along with tipping that occurs sometime in late spring or early summer. Predominantly where hot summer heat is an issue, and this is for most of the southeast, these floricane fruiting types are what we recommend to be grown commercially. Primocane fruiting types, again, produce fruit on first year growth, which means that they flower and fruit later. So they flower in midsummer and then fruit in early fall. They're managed a little bit differently. They are managed with minimal fall pruning, but they must be tipped in late spring in order to get good yields. There's also an alternative management system where instead of just managing the crop for only primocane growth, these primocanes can actually be held over into the second year, and a small spring crop can be produced on those floricanes. This can result in a situation where you're actually getting two harvests off the same plant in the same year, where if you hold the floricane or primocane over into the second year so that it's a floricane, you get that small floricane crop harvest, and then the new primocanes that come up that year will also provide you with a fall harvest. Now, if you remember back, I talked about the windows that are open in the current blackberry market, where these floricane types are really hitting that early market where Mexico is first getting out of the season. And these primocane types are really hitting that later season in the fall where the price really gets even higher. But unfortunately, summer heat is really going to limit our ability to produce these primocane types, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail later on in this presentation. Let's talk about the different plant growth characteristics blackberries can have. Canes can vary quite a bit from being very erect types to very trailing types. Erect types are much like a bush and will stand up on their own and may not need any type of trellising system to hold the branches upright. Whereas a trailing type is much more like a vine and will need some type of trellising system to keep the canes up off of the ground. There's a medium type that's a semi-erect that is somewhere between being completely erect and being a trailing type. Then, of course, canes can vary in whether they are thorny or thornless. Alright, let's move on to talk about life cycle and how these different cane types grow and develop through the different months and seasons of the year. In December, January, and February, the canes are in their dormant stage. It may seem like there's not a lot going on, but there are some important physiological processes that must occur during dormancy in order for the plants to resume normal plant growth in the spring. The first of these is flower bud initiation. Now, flower bud initiation is just when the plant starts to develop buds, and these buds are later going to differentiate or divide into flowers and leaves. Blackberries have what's called mixed buds, so flowers and leaves are held together in the same bud. When initiation and differentiation happens is really dependent on day length, cultivar, and temperature. But in general, as the days get shorter and temperatures start to drop, initiation and differentiation occur. Chilling hours is just the calculation of the number of hours at which temperatures are between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. There's several different models out there, but generally we start calculating chilling hours after the first frost. Certain models also estimate that chilling hours are lost when temperatures rise above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the reason why it's important to calculate how many hours are between those two temperatures is because that this amount of time of chilling is really important to determine whether or not a plant can resume normal growth in the spring. If not enough chilling hours are accumulated over the winter or the dormant period, the plants may resume growth in an abnormal way, and I'll talk about some of those symptoms here in a second. Cold damage is another process that may occur during cane dormancy. It's often referred to as winter injury, and it occurs at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. This threshold temperature is really why blackberries are not grown in more northern regions. However, it is important to remember that cold damage can occur when the temperature is actually higher than 0 degrees Fahrenheit, when we have winter temperature fluctuations. For instance, if the temperature jumps into the 70s and then drops very rapidly into the 20s, you may observe cold damage to occur even though the temperature did not get to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So what are some of the symptoms of a lack of chilling hours and cold damage? When we have a lack of chilling hours or a very warm winter, you may see delayed or sporadic bud break, which may result in a more spread out season because the buds opened and flowered over a longer period. That means that we'll get berries over a longer period. But it can also result in bud death and ultimately reduced yields. When cold damage occurs, it results in cane dieback and the failure of those lateral canes to develop. Alright, so this idea that blackberry plants have to get an adequate number of chilling hours every winter in order to resume normal growth in spring is going to be an important consideration in choosing which types of varieties are going to be well suited for your area. And the reason for that is that different areas, of course, vary in how much chilling they get on average. On the left-hand side, I have a map that shows some averages across our region and across the United States. And you can see that within the southern region, we really have some big variations, where Virginia, northern Arkansas may be getting 700, maybe even 900 average hours of chilling. And southern Louisiana and Georgia, on the other hand, are probably only getting 100, maybe up to 300 hours of chilling. So on the right-hand side, I have a list of different varieties that have been released by the University of Arkansas Blackberry Breeding Program and some of the estimates of the chilling hours that they require. So you can see Navajo and Apache probably require somewhere around 800 to 900 hours, whereas Primark 45 and Natchez are much more low-chill varieties, only requiring around 300 hours. So if you are in southern Louisiana or southern Georgia, Primark 45 or Natchez may do better for you because on average you're only going to get around 300 hours, and so that's all that those varieties require. You may not want to try and plant a Navajo or Apache because those varieties are very often, or if not ever, going to get the number of chilling hours that they need. By the other token, if you're in a more northern region and you plant a variety that has lower requirement for chilling, it is important to remember that if that plant gets the required chilling hours that it needs, and then we hit a warm spell, say in February, that plant may start to come out of dormancy well before the winter is actually over and may experience some cold injury in that way. So it may be better to plant a variety that has higher chill hours, that has a higher requirement for chill hours, so that it doesn't come out of dormancy too early on in the winter. Now as we move from the winter into the spring and summer months, the plants will start to wake up and start to bud out. During this period, temperature is still a very important factor, and this is particularly true once the plants start producing their reproductive structures or start producing flowers. Now, Fumi Takeda at the USDA ARS actually did some research on this and found that there was a minimum temperature for all three of the major reproductive stages, whether that be tight bud, popcorn stage, or the stage where you can just start to see the petals, all the way to that open blossom stage. And that temperature is 27 degrees Fahrenheit. So below that temperature, these floral structures will experience damage. Now, unfortunately, in the southeast, we have something that very often occurs that's called blackberry winter. And this just refers to when we get a cold spell that occurs when blackberries are in bloom. Now, if we get a cold spell and the temperatures drop below that 27-degree threshold when the flowers are open or in the popcorn stage or in the tight bud stage, we will see some damage that will occur to these floral structures. Very often what we'll see is black eyes or black centers that you can kind of see in this right-hand picture, and that means that the flower was killed and we will not get a berry from that flower. Now once we move past that critical time period, we can expect to see ripe fruit from that flowering stage in about 35 to 45 days. Now a lot of that variation in time period is dependent on local climatic conditions and variety. Typically we see a harvest period of 4 to 7 weeks. I do have some data here kind of showing how different varieties can be used together to spread out the blackberry harvest season. And this is some data from Clarksville, Arkansas. Clarksville, Arkansas is where our fruit research station is, and it's in zone 7A. So the average day of first harvest for Natchez, Natchez being one of our earliest varieties, tends to be around June 5th with its peak fruiting at June 17th. You can see Osage follows soon after that, and then Ouachita. And then we have Navajo and Apache really ending out our season with their first harvest around June 20th and June 25th, and then their peak fruiting in the first week of July. Now, during this time period, as the plants are flowering and moving into fruiting, we still do worry about temperature, and we worry when temperatures get over 85 or 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Typically, this is the biggest issue for our primocane fruiting blackberries. You remember that primocane fruiting blackberries are our fall fruiting blackberries. So that means that they're flowering sometime generally in the middle of the summer, and that's of course when we have our highest temperatures. And when we have those high temperatures during flowering, really the issues that we see are poor fruit set and poor pollination. But also sometimes, particularly on our primocane fruiting varieties, we'll see something called a double berry. So these high temperatures during flowering for primocane fruiting varieties is really what limits their productivity and use here in the southeast. After the harvest season is over, the fruiting floricanes will die. Those canes should be removed through pruning practices as soon as possible. At this point, the remaining primocanes are technically the upcoming season's floricanes. As the plants do enter dormancy, the leaves will fall off of the primocanes, but you should still be able to tell the difference between the primocanes or the next season's floricanes and the previous year's dead floricanes, because the primocanes will still have a red color to them, to the canes, whereas the dead floricanes will be more silvery. A given planting can have production for up to a decade. Generally, we recommend to growers after about 6 or 7 years that they start considering putting in a new planting in anticipation of their current planting going out of production. So now that you know a little bit about the basic biology of blackberry plants, let's talk about some of the things that you need to think about before jumping into producing blackberries commercially. Often people get very excited about the prospect of growing a new crop, but very often they may not be aware of all of the details that go into being successful in actually growing and producing that crop. In the case of blackberries, some of the things that a grower might need to take into consideration are what type of trellising systems are out there and available, which varieties are going to be most well adapted for their region, where they're going to order plants and how are they going to transplant them, how are they going to soil test and then amend and prepare their soil, how are they going to raise beds, what type of mulch or pre-emergent herbicides might they choose to use, and then testing their irrigation source and setting up drip irrigation. Because these are just a few of the things that go into successful blackberry production, we generally recommend to growers that they have a year zero or a planning year. And during this planning year, there are several different things that they should do to prepare before they even start to put those blackberry plants in the ground. And one of the first things that growers should do before they even think about ordering plants or buying any type of equipment is figuring out where and how they're going to market and sell their blackberries. It's one thing to be able to grow blackberries successfully, but it's another thing to actually be able to sell them successfully. There's a lot of different marketing opportunities out there between pick your own, farm stands, farmers markets, or even wholesale markets. The second major issue is labor, and this is a really big issue for a lot of horticultural crops, but particularly fruit crops that require a lot of hand labor. We can talk about yields. For an average erect or a trailing type, you may get anywhere from 10 to 18 pounds per plant, and around 1,200 plants per acre. That means 12,000 to 20,000 pounds per acre as a potential yield. And you may be yielding that again for 6 to 10 years. Now that sounds great if you're trying to think about the economics, but the reality of that is all those pounds of blackberries have to be picked by hand. So it's a lot of labor to produce this crop and then get it out of the field. In addition, there's a lot of labor, and so these are probably the two biggest questions growers need to be able to answer. Where are they going to sell their product, and how are they going to get it harvested? Site selection is also going to be a really important aspect of planning for a successful blackberry operation. And this is true in particular for most fruit crops, because we're talking about perennial crops, or crops that are going to be in the ground for several years. So we want to try and make sure that when we start out, we give the crop the best opportunity to be successful. In the case of blackberries and most fruit production, we want a site that has full sun. So we want to be really aware of adjacent trees that might cast shadows over the crop and shade the crop either in the early morning or in the late afternoon. We want a soil that is well drained and deep, So we don't want a soil that's prone to flooding or holding water for too long. Blackberries don't like to have wet feet, as we say. We also want a site that has good air movement. We want to make sure that the site has access to irrigation and to roads. So irrigation so that we can keep the crop well watered, and then roads so that we can make sure that once we're harvesting that crop, it's easy to get the crop out of the field and to the market. Now, there's a few things that are important to be aware of. Things like aspect. Aspect refers to what direction does the slope face. So if a slope is facing northward, that may mean that there's less freeze damage potential because that slope will warm up more slowly in the spring. A slope is facing southward, there's a higher freeze damage potential because that slope will warm up more quickly in the spring, which may mean that that crop will actually come out of dormancy a little bit earlier and may be more prone to late freezes. If it's more eastward, there's less disease potential because the sun rises in the east, so those dews in the morning get dried off quicker, so the foliage is not as wet for as long in the morning. And if a slope faces west, there's generally going to be warmer afternoon temperatures, which may have some impacts on our fruit quality. Generally, we try and get berries out of the field as early as possible in the morning because once they start to warm up, the fruit quality really goes down. It's important to be aware of row orientation. How are you going to orient your rows? Generally, north and south is preferred, but if you have to go up and down a slope, east and west is going to be better. You might want to be aware of the site history, avoid an area that has a history of being planted in black walnuts, and then also avoid that has a lot of wild blackberries currently because those blackberries can harbor disease or insects that may attack your commercial blackberry crop. In some places throughout the southeast that may be quite difficult because there is a lot of wild blackberry throughout the southeast, but again, blackberry is a crop that is native to the United States. But in the case where you do have a lot of wild blackberry, you may want to try and remove as much of that wild blackberry from the edges of the field as possible. It's also important to remember that if you're planting on the side of a hill, if you're up at the top of the hill, it's going to be cooler. If you get down to the bottom of the hill, that's generally where cold air will accumulate and you may have a frost pocket, and then the soil may be wetter down at the base of the hill. So these are all important considerations to take in mind when you're choosing a site. Variety selection is also an important part of planning for a successful commercial blackberry operation. I'm not going to talk about variety selection too much right now because Dr. John Clark is going to give a different presentation later on variety selection. I do want to point out though that growers will want to make sure and identify what their transplant source is going to be at least 1 year prior to planning to plant. So they're going to want to identify where they're buying those plants pretty early on. There's a couple of different options for types of plants that growers can get. Tissue cultured plants generally come as plugs, and you can see that a picture of a blackberry plug over here on the right hand side on the bottom. Tissue cultured plants are tested for known viruses and diseases, so they are indexed and certified to be free of the viruses and diseases that we're aware of. Bare root and rooted plants are also an option and are generally a little bit cheaper. No matter what type of plant source you go with, we do recommend that you ask a lot of questions of the plant propagator. What type of practices do they do to try and prevent virus and disease transmission within their operation? Just to kind of give you a general idea of the number of plants that you're looking at buying per acre, at a 4-foot in row spacing or 4 foot between plants and 10 foot between row spacing, that's around 1,090 plants per acre. I would say typically most growers go for a little bit tighter spacing between plants, so they're probably closer to a 3 foot between plant spacing, but we're looking at around 1,000 plants per acre. Another thing that you growers will want to start planning for is choosing a trellising method. I'm not going to talk about this topic too much in this class because we will cover it in the second class. But there's a lot of different trellising options out there. Previously I said that generally blackberries are not grown in the more northern parts of the United States because of cold, but that's not entirely true anymore because of this development of this rotating cross-arm trellis that will actually allow the blackberry plants to be laid down on the ground over the winter, and that will allow a blanket to go over the plants and actually protect them and raise the temperature around the plants. And that has facilitated the ability of people to actually plant blackberries in more northern climates. Some more standard trellising options are a T-bar trellis like you can see in this picture in the middle, or a V trellis like the picture you can see on the right hand side. At least 6 to 12 months prior, growers will want to start working on their site preparation. This can begin with a soil test to evaluate what the soil pH is and what nutrients might need to be added into the soil. Growers may also want to do a test of the salt content of the soil if they applied a lot of manure there. Growers will also want to get their irrigation water tested to make sure that it's going to be suitable for blackberry production, and they'll want to start working on setting up their system. Eliminating noxious weeds as early on as possible. Again, we are dealing with a perennial crop, so we're going to want to try and knock down the weed seed bank as much as possible before we actually go into the field with our blackberry plants. This can be done with several different types of herbicides, but also cover crops may be an option. Deep tillage may need to be done at this point. Again, it's a perennial crop. We want to try and prep the soil as much as possible before we go in with our plants. Creating a raised bed, whether it's either with a bed layer or some kind of disc system to hill up rows, will be desirable. Again, we're trying to create the best system of drainage within the row where the blackberry roots are going to be concentrated. You can kind of see that in this picture here on the right, that where the blackberry plants are being planted, they're actually being planted on top of a raised bed or a hilled up row. There's also different options for mulching. Generally, we recommend black plastic or landscape fabric. Landscape fabric has a much longer lifespan and does a really good job of keeping weeds down. Generally, black plastic will only last for a season or two. Bark is also an option, but generally we recommend to growers to avoid hay because they can bring in a lot of weed seeds. Part of soil preparation is amending the soil pH to a range between 6 or 6.5. And with that, we want to make sure that we do that at least 6 months prior to planting so the lime has time to take full effect. And then growers can plan to plant in the early spring before the soil warms, but they will want to make sure that it's after the last chance of any frost if they're using plugs. And they will want to make sure that they're planting level with the soil so that they're not burying the crown. Some growers in the southeast can plant in the fall because we do have a longer fall. So if we were planting sometime in the middle of September, that would allow probably about 4 to 6 weeks for the plants to become established before the first frost. But generally we recommend planting in the early spring. So after we make it through our planting year, we're going to move into year 1, and that's going to be the year that we plant and establish the crop. So year 1 should really be focused on getting the plants into the ground sometime in the early spring, and then encouraging good root and crown establishment over that first year. If the plants start to produce any flowers or fruit, we recommend that those be removed or pinched off so that the plant can put all of its resources into, again, establishing a really strong root system that's going to support successful production in later years. In year 2, we may expect some small harvest. And then year 3 and 4 and onward, we're going to expect a more consistent harvest from year to year. In this picture, you can really see a good comparison between the size of the plants between year 1 and year 2. So on the left-hand side, you can see plants that have only been in the ground for about 4 months. So this is their year 1. They were just planted in the early spring and we're now sometime in early summer. And then on the right-hand side, you can see plants that were planted the previous year. They're now in their second year. And you can see that they are loaded with berries and we're getting a pretty good harvest off of them. So that's really the difference that you can see in just 1 year of growth on blackberry plants. So because this class is broken up into how to manage your blackberry planting through the different seasons of the year, I want to talk about what are some of the tasks that should be done during the winter or during the dormant period. One of the biggest ones is winter pruning. And rather than show you or discuss it through a PowerPoint slide, I'm going to refer you to a video here in a second done by Tanya Ernst, who is one of our employees at the Clarksville Fruit Research Station, which is one of the University of Arkansas research stations. And she's going to walk you through how to prune floricane fruiting varieties in the winter. While you are doing your pruning practices, you will also want to walk through your orchard or planting and inspect your trellis and irrigation system and see if there's anything that needs to be corrected or fixed. And then while you're pruning, it's also a really good time to inspect the canes for disease or insects. You also want to put together a pre-emergent herbicide plan, and if you're planning for some new plantings that will be going on in the upcoming months, you want to go ahead and start working on preparing land and supplies for those new plantings. Thanks so much for watching.